Hi, everyone. So we're going to begin with the next panel. My name is Ximena Bustamante. I am a member of DSA and also of Women's Strike New York City. And I want to thank everyone for being here, to all the people that we have been co-organizing the event with, and also with our wonderful speakers. We have 4 speakers, one that is going to arrive at any time, one that is going to arrive anytime. Just briefly, let me just introduce by name, and then before they speak, we can read their bio. Jia Lee is from the movement of rank and file educators. Cynthia Soohoo is a professor of law at CUNY Law School. Perfect. Scarlett. Scarlett Ahmed is with the New York Public Employees Federation, and she is the chair of the Women's Committee, among other positions. And then Jessica González-Rojas is the outgoing executive director at the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health, and she's also running for State Senate. State Assembly, sorry, for Jackson Heights, Queens. Right? Okay. So let me begin with the framing for this panel. So I believe that it's very important to remark that this panel is not an academic panel, right? But it's a panel in which we're bringing together people that are actually engaged in what I would like to call political practice, in a broad understanding of what is political. Whether that be in unions, as Gia and Scarlett, in human rights clinics, as Cindy, and in social justice organizations, as Jessica. There is a knowledge that can only emanate from practice. However, this knowledge is not readily available, right? It has to be systematized, it has to be structured, but this systematization has to be done collectively. The spaces available for this kind of explicit collective systematization, like this one, are rare. However, they are very relevant. And they are relevant for 2 reasons. One is because collective systematization of knowledge, when it's done explicitly, allows for the concepts and frameworks that emerge from this systematization to be increasingly broad, increasingly refined, and also makes them able to speak to the complexity of life experience, right? And also, because when we explicitly do this systematization together, it makes it more difficult for the unrifled appropriation of concepts and discourse, which are, in the last analysis, always collective, right? So all the panels that you are going to see today have more or less a pretty defined discursive field, so to speak. However, this panel is a little bit distinct because it's dealing with an intersection, and it's an intersection that has been little explored. So we are still developing categories and frameworks to address this intersection, right? An intersection is, broadly speaking, feminist organizing and labor organizing, and more specifically, reproductive justice and labor. So we're going to explore different perspectives on how this intersection looks like in practice. So I'm going to be speaking a little bit more than other moderators, precisely because I want to offer a background on how we can engage with this intersection, and suggest a few paths for the conversation. So about the background, there are a couple of phenomena happening around the world. On the one hand, and we already heard a little bit about this in the previous panel, there is a feminist upsurge happening, all across the world. However, saying that it's just a feminist upsurge is rather imprecise. It's like a feminist upsurge plus something else, right? And we are trying to figure out, what is that something else? In many countries, decades of austerity politics have led to right-wing forces to become really strong among the working class. And to the surprise of the liberal establishment, as it has happened in the US, they have even been able to win presidential elections, right? So the feminist movement is one of the few forces that has a widespread geographical reach, and that has been at the front of mounting a resistance to right-wing governments and also a resistance to decades of austerity politics. In recent years, the women's strike as a tactic has become the quintessential tactic of this feminist upsurge. There are many precedents about the women's strike. I am not gonna touch upon that today. I just want to mention a few examples, right, of recent feminist women's strikes. And those have been, in Poland, in Argentina, in Spain, and in Chile, for instance. What I want to say today is that the women's strike is an example of how the feminist movement appropriates a labor tactic, right? And the thing is that this appropriation of a labor tactic speaks about a broader process in which feminism is giving itself the task to translate the concepts and frameworks, its concepts and frameworks to the language of organized labor, and it's identifying intersections in both of these realms, organizational and political practice, right? So besides this phenomenon of a feminist upsurge that is somehow borrowing from labor, there's a parallel phenomenon. And it's interesting that this parallel phenomena can be seen in many of the same countries where there have been massive women's strikes. We should remember that when we speak about neoliberalism, we are not only speaking about fiscal austerity or privatizations, but we are also speaking about a whole rearrangement of labor and of a change in the character of labor and a very explicit attack on organized labor, right? A process of both cooptation and clear attack. So in each of the countries where there have been massive women's strikes, the labor movement looks differently, but in all of them, it has been decimated, right? Some cases are worse than others, Poland is worse than Spain, but still the thing is bad. This parallel development that I'm speaking about is certain kind of revival of the labor movement, slow but steady revival. And the interesting thing is that it has been happening in certain sectors, right? Mostly in care work and feminized sectors, right? Or in sectors that have a huge amount of public employees. And just to give a couple of examples, in Poland, the women's strike of 2016, it was the most massive, not only in numbers, but in geographical reach mobilization since the fall of the wall. Shortly after the women's strike, there was this massive teacher strike that again was widespread geographically. Before the women's strike, there's a whole precedent of pre-K teachers organizing, right? So there's something that, a movement within labor, specifically in care work sectors that precedes and also follows, the women's strike. In Chile, same thing. The biggest mobilization since the fall of the dictatorship was before these recent uprisings, March 8th of this year. And this March 8th was the first time in which the feminist movement in Chile actually called for a women's strike, right? So these are just a couple of examples. I guess that what I would like to ask today, is how the reverse of this equation looks like, right? Which means that in the women's strike is just, as I was saying, the example of a process in which feminism is translating its own practices and language to the language of labor and thinking about the intersections of organizing and political practice. How is the opposite looking like? Meaning, how does it look like for labor to actually translate its own struggles into the language of feminist organizing and bring into it the political and organizational practice of feminism, right? And this is the most complicated one, right? Of the two sides. So I guess that the point that I want to make here is that the women's strike is just a symptom, right? It's just the visible manifestation of another process that is this intersection of feminist and labor organizing. And today we're going to address that intersection, but specifically around reproductive justice and labor, right? Let me tell you how we're going to do that with the speakers that we have here today. We have two speakers that are involved in labor and two speakers that are involved in reproductive justice organizing. So regarding how sort of like feminist politics, how labor opens up to feminist politics and to feminist organizing, I want to suggest two avenues. The first one is that we are going to address we could say, emergence or re-emergence of feminist or proto-feminist organizing sort of like nucleus within unions, right? And I mean, right now, this is happening. I mean, it's a kind of like silent process within unions. There are like many women's committees being created or sort of like brought back from the dead, right? Like, and it's also happening in non-unionized labor, like worker centers, right? That women's sectors are being created. It's still a messy sort of like process. Many of these committees don't have a very clear direction on where they're going, but it's happening, right? Like, and I just want to mention one example of this international example in Argentina that, of course, has a way more developed feminist movement and in which this intersection is like has been like more has been flourishing. There's something called La Intersindical Feminista, which is basically an example of this, right? Like women within unions that have this like parallel structure, right? Like where they come together and they sort of like organize at the intersection of labor and feminism. So this is like one of the manifestations of labor bringing feminism in that we're going to discuss. And the other one, and I just want to say that we could think about this example as a disruption of like certain order, right? Because unions are founded in certain equivalence between workers, even if there's a hierarchy within unions, right? The premise is like we are all equivalent as workers, right? So when something like a women's committee comes into a union or something like the Intersyndical Feminista is formed, you know, like parallel to unions, there's like some rupture or some like violation there, right? Like, because there's a, somehow, I mean, like it entails that there's some other equivalence, you know, like within, you know, like the union and within organized labor, right? That between women, I mean, and there's a need for that organizing and a separation with men workers, right? So the second manifestation that we're going to be addressing today has to do with another disruption, I would like to call it like that, which is the disruption of the objectives of organized labor. So we can see this in examples of how there are labor sectors that are demanding things that go beyond what they are supposed to demand in the context of a contract negotiation, right? And that they are spilling to realms that are considered, you know, like the social or, you know, like, right, like, and by doing that, they are also including in their struggle people that are do not understand themselves as labor, right? Okay, so those are like the two examples that we're addressing today. And then, yeah, in the case of reproductive justice, we're going to also open that question, right? How do we see labor acting within reproductive justice? So, yeah. I guess that I would like to ask you, you know, like two questions.
Okay.
Right? The first one is about the struggle that the UFT, the teachers union, had around parental leave, right? And how the progressive caucus more pushed for family leave. I want to ask you, how was that battle frame, both by the union and by the progressive caucus, right? How it was organized, who did it include, and if you think that this is sort of like, it could be thought of like a reproductive justice organizing within a union.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to thank all of the organizers of this event. This is amazing. I'm feeling extremely empowered amongst you all today, and so thank you, Ximena, for inviting me on this panel with these amazing people. I'm 4th and 5th grade special education teacher. I'm at the Earth School in the East Village. It's a public progressive elementary school. Yeah, they exist. We're a rare species right now, and we're under attack. And I mentioned that I'm also a parent. I have a 16-year-old who's gone through the public education system, is currently undergoing gender transformation, and thinking about her experience in the public school system as well. And then just having had a kid without any parental leave to speak of, and just thinking at that time, like, okay, so there's no, I just have to do what I have to do, right? And so this is definitely an issue, but I want to start kind of with this framing, because I heard it in the panel before this about feminism and how it must be connected, or like reproductive rights has to be connected to other issues, and how it's connected to broader frames of Black Lives Matter, indigenous rights, and et cetera. And I think I want to attribute this to George Lakoff. How many of you all are familiar with who George Lakoff is? He's a linguistics professor. He talks about these two frames, right? The patriarchal frame, which is basically like father knows best. We can call it the white supremacist frame. That is, the decisions are made by those who know best, who've earned their degrees, who've have status in a classist system, right? In a very capitalist system, your wealth is equated to your value. Your wealth accumulation in our society is equated to your value. This is the message our kids are bombarded with. Mm-hmm. This is the message that I remember thinking like, oh, I don't have this or that. You know, my kid is constantly reminding me that these are our values. Versus what we're talking about in feminism as the nurturant model is what George Lakoff describes. And it can be found in the Black Lives Matter 13 guiding principles. Right? If you're familiar with the 13 guiding principles, they talk about everything that has to do with a nurturant model. You can also find it in every indigenous set of principles, right? Like the 7th generation principle. Taking care of your planet, taking care of each other, instead of like spaces where there's experts at the front, it's a circle, right? And we are all equal. So in that context, right, we started this caucus within our union to bring about nurturant values, right? So we're not just talking like the issues of parental leave, or even like we were calling for family leave, because we have a lot of members who end up like having to care for a family member, because our system does not value our elderly, our sick, right? Let alone having health care that's affordable. Or just free healthcare. We don't, and so it is left, it's a huge burden, and we don't realize it. We just take it for granted that this is the reality. You're gonna have to find time. There's like Family Leave Act at the federal level, right? But not everyone can really benefit for that because it's not typically paid for. And that's a huge issue. So we're not just talking about the issues themselves of reproductive rights, of your right to nurture your child in the first months of life, and to heal your bodies. We're talking also about process and how decisions are made. So the nurturant model is also questioning decision-making process. So as a caucus, we're talking about, no, we don't want to just fight for parental leave. We want to fight for democratic process within our union, because it is not democratic in our union spaces. We had to build up this petition that started years before there was another petition that garnered thousands of signatures from all over the United States, which put a lot of pressure. So we are basically, as a caucus, dovetailing off of the voices of so many people and then going out very publicly on that. Without the movement of people's voices, like through a petition, through, people that, in the streets marching, and then having public shaming, right? This is how our system works, where you have to get enough people, enough pressure to put shame on those who are in positions of power to make decisions. That's actually how it happened. We got on the news, because we basically organized a rally in front of our union office to take this on, because it wasn't something they were initially going to take on until there was such public pressure. We went from family leave to paid parental leave for 6 weeks. So I'll just tell you a little story about myself. I had my kid in 2003, and we didn't have, any paid leave. But we did have something called like 30 days of like reserve date that you could use for sick time. That was paid. So we're basically having to say, I'm sick. You're sick when you have a kid. because you have to use your sick days, and I had 30 of them, and I had to go and, never mind doctor's visits, never mind all those, visits that you go before while you're pregnant. I had to use up all those days, and I was literally back to work when my kid was 5 weeks. 5 weeks. I had to find childcare at 5 weeks old. So, that was not a good. I'm so excited, extremely excited. We get the 6 weeks of paid leave. It's not enough. The union is saying, well, you can use your sick days too, and that'll give you 12 to 14 weeks. Right? Yay! No. And we also want to continue to fight, so, for a full family leave, until we get the kind of care that we need for the people in our communities. So that's a little bit of the strategy, but, ultimately, it's a lot of, organizing in our schools, spreading things very publicly, and luck. Real, timing. Timing is huge. Timing and luck, the pressure has to be there. There's a certain element of luck to this, too. So I do, I feel fortunate. But that's just one element, and we're still going to fight for the family leave. So that was the first question.
Right.
Right?
Right. And then the second one, this example of the struggle around the family leave, it seems like more squarely, to fit, that
Right.
to be reproductive justice oriented. However, it's kind of focusing on the members of the union, right? So then this second question, which is a more complicated one, has to do when, how can we see this intersection beyond the members of the union, right? So what I want to ask you is, if you can talk to us about, the recent wave of teacher strikes and how in some of those cases we've been seeing teachers, push for demands that go beyond sort of bread and butter. So what I want to know is, why do you think that these demands are getting into sort of the repertoire of organized labor? Do you think that these demands can be understood as reproductive justice demands? And who have been part of that struggle? Yeah.
Okay. So let's remember that in the teaching force, women represent about 80%. So when you see the privatization attack on public education, it's an attack on women.
Right.
It's an attack on women. It's an attack on the very fabric of education. Right? Education, if you think about it, could be done correctly, right? Part of a nurturant model that we want to nurture our children into the world. And what happens in the classrooms, right, is really dependent on the values of possibly the teacher or the administration, but increasingly over the last decade and a half, it's privatizers, corporate ed reformers, who are imposing their patriarchal forms of educational practice and process, curriculum, right? High-stakes standardized testing, Common Core, all of that. And in the guise of closing the achievement gap and racial justice. And it's all BS, because the people who are dictating what that means for us are coming from the top 1%. In this country. It's the hedge funds, it's the Wall Street folks who get together and impose policies through ALEC on education policy. Betsy DeVos, but it's Democrats and Republicans, right? So with that being said, you see this play out in different states across the country, and I just want to point out, the movement of rank and file educators is a caucus that kind of started with grassroots educators, but also merged with parent organizations and other groups like NICOR and Teachers Unite. And MORE is part of a national network of caucuses called UCOR. We named ourselves a couple years ago. We were just a loose network. So how many of you guys know the Chicago Teachers Union? Right? They just had a huge strike. CORE, the Caucus of Rank and File Educators, took over power early, I think it's 2009, 2010, something like that. And you've seen them transform their union from within. And then in Los Angeles, UTLA, my God, they had huge, massive, successful strike against privatizers who spent like millions of dollars to put ed reformers into their school board, right? Charter friendly, all these folks into the school board. They won huge gains in their strike, contract strike, and their union was taken over by Union Power, UP, which is a caucus that's connected to MORE. And they went in and they saw how very little organizing was happening. They developed connections. So basically took their union building, which is in downtown Los Angeles. And, you know, I'm originally from California, and I'd go to K-Town, you know, like Koreatown, down there and hang out. I never knew that UTLA's office was down there. I was so awesomely surprised 4 years ago, and we had our national convening there. And UTLA was already starting to plan for their strike 4 years ago. But when you go there, they realized they needed to bring in the parent organizations that were fighting for nurses, guidance counselors, smaller class sizes, and just like basic foundational aid because their schools were falling apart. They made space in their union building for them to have regular meetings and for them to constantly be in communication with each other. That's unheard of, right? So this idea of a nurturant model is not just like, oh, we're teachers, and I would argue bread and butter issues are social justice reproductive right issues. Because we're talking about a working wage, we're talking about health benefits, we're talking about all these things. So to separate them is a false dichotomy, right? So all of these things were considered. So UTLA won huge gains in guidance counselors, smaller class sizes, putting charter school caps, you know, just basic things. And then in Chicago, they won naps for their pre-K students. It's ludicrous. Also, like recess time, play, which is the work of children, right? These basic, I would call them like human rights and child right, you know, rights, were things they had to fight for in contracts. And we saw in Seattle, Washington as well, where they mandated Black and ethnic studies and increased recess time for like 1 hour. Something that, you know, like you would think is like ridiculous. I remember going to elementary school and having recess would seem like forever and had, you know, like thoroughly exhausted. But yeah, like kids these days just don't have it like that. And who will fight for it if it's not those of us who are working directly with them, with their families? And they don't know, families don't really know until we tell them what's going on. But there's been a gag order on teachers. And you see the strike wave happening because the teachers are like fed up and saying, no, you see West Virginia, this is a right to work state where they don't even have collective bargaining rights. And they swept, all 55 counties went out on a strike. And then when their union bosses told them, all right, we came to an agreement, and it wasn't what they wanted, it turned into a wildcat at the state capitol. The teachers went, go back to the table, chanting it over and over again. I got chills every single time I think about it, with like 80% women dominating in West Virginia, the teacher force, and them telling their union bosses to go back to the table. So all of these strikes have to do with like this top-down ed reform set of policies that are supposed to be under the guise of like racial justice, right? But really have been the most austere and the most fascist imposition of policies on our kids and on the backs of the teachers and their families and the communities. So those fights are it's so interconnected, you can't separate the two.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I just wanted to add that I agree that, you know, like it's a false dichotomy to separate bread and butter from, you know, like reproductive justice issues. I guess that the question that perhaps remains open is the relation between these two things that we discussed, you know, like with you, which is, you know, like it's extremely relevant for care workers in public sectors specifically to be able to care for their own families, right? But what is, let's say, the difference when they are fighting for the commons, right? Not only for their own sort of like rights as workers within a sector, but using their position to push for the commons, which is what I'm hearing also that you are saying in this second example, right? Yeah. We can continue the conversation about this on the Q&A. I just want to then move to our other kind of like example of how labor opens up to like feminist organizing. And as I was saying before, there is this phenomena of women's committees being sort of like created and disrupting certain orders, like within unions. And as I said before, we do know that many of them are still trying to find their way. And that's why it's the more important to have these conversations, right? And I know that there are like quite a few socialists, I should say, like chairing these committees. Scarlett is one of them, and she's a member of the SA. So I guess that, Scarlett, I would like to begin with, like the question of what are the issues that you are dealing with concerning women in your union, right? And if we can think about those issues as reproductive justice issues.
Thank you for inviting me, and I'm very intimidated by the women around me and the women I heard earlier. I'm usually the person in the back of the room doing, the work of getting an event going, not necessarily the speaker, so bear with me if I'm nervous. My union's very interesting. It's the Public Employees Federation of New York, which is a union that represents the professional, scientific, and technical workers of the New York State government workforce. So it is a statewide union. It is the second biggest statewide public sector union in New York, and we're affiliated with AFT and SEIU. Now, because we're a statewide union, I would say the social and political values of our members kind of reflects the upstate, downstate divide. And that can make it tricky to navigate if you're a bit of a radical. And as an activist, I've come to want to kind of stay in my lane on some issues, because I can see that a lot of, like 40% of the members in our union, maybe more, voted for Trump. Yeah, so you can imagine the fun that I have sometimes. We represent state agencies. Probably the biggest source of membership is the Department of Health. Now, a lot of those professions tend to be feminized: nurses, healthcare workers, occupational therapists. And one of the other big employers is the Department of Transportation. Manly jobs, right? And facility managers and things like that. And then there's the Department of Corrections, where we represent parole officers. And interestingly, a lot of them are black women, especially here in New York City. So I have to be very careful, because I tend to be somewhat anti-police, because I marched with Black Lives Matter after Eric Garner was murdered. But I have to be careful around my black sisters in the union who may work in law enforcement, and some of them have children and loved ones who are cops, so I don't want to be the great white liberal, saying, yeah, screw the police, and, my sisters might have more complex feelings about that. But let me tell the story of our women's committee. When the first Women's March happened right after Trump's election, we did not participate in any way in that. And I happened to be out of the country when it happened, and I knew there was no way. Given the fact that my union is mostly a service model union, given the politics of the members, there was no way that we were going to get involved in that. We do tend to stick to bread and butter, terms and conditions of employment. But I started knitting, I had taught myself to crochet. And at executive board meetings, I was just randomly making pussycat hats, even though I don't even like them. I don't like pink, but I just would make them in different colors. I made red because it's more radical. And people would say, hey, can I have one? Can I have one? Before I knew it, like 50 women had red and purple and pink pussycat hats, and we wore them on International Women's Day when we had an executive board session. So that was like my first radical thing. I crocheted red pussycat hats. And then we did participate in the second Women's March, and I kind of made that happen with one of our VPs from upstate New York. And because we had made it happen, we had to answer the hate mail from the other union members, including from women. You know, a lot of, women said, this is just an anti-Trump rally, I love Trump, these are just women who want abortion, I hate abortion, and then there was charges of anti-Semitism, too, with Linda Sarsour and all of that, and a lot of my members are Jewish, and they're sensitive to that. And I did not answer those, because my last name is Ahmed. I'm like, I'm staying out of that. I'll let the other vice president handle that hate mail. So in that context, one of my regional coordinators said, oh, Scarlett, we should, in this moment, we should organize, kind of revive our women's committees. Because they existed on paper, but they weren't really happening. So in the fall of 2008, we met in New York City for the first time, and I just let the women talk. I'm the chair, but I've never been the chair of a women's committee. I don't even really think of myself as a women's activist. I think of myself as a socialist, so I probably do break down my political activism more on class than gender, although I understand intersectionality. And a lot of my sisters are Black women, a lot of them are Caribbean immigrants, so I just listened to their struggles. We just told each other our stories, and a lot of, and they amazed me. These women who came from other countries, got themselves educated as nurses, social workers, went back for higher degrees, and at the same time they may have been navigating cultural attitudes within their own families, domestic violence, and they're facing the struggles that we have as state workers, which tends to be, the issues that they are really concerned about relate to understaffing. Like, even though we have a Democratic governor, whoopee, we are still struggling under an austerity budget. So when people retire, that work is absorbed by my sisters, and then that can be dangerous in healthcare settings. So we've had a campaign recently about workplace violence because one of our nurses get attacked all the time where they work in state facilities, prisons, state hospitals, psychiatric centers. So that's a big issue for them. Now, some of the activities that we have done, again, I kind of prefer to follow the lead of my sisters. We did participate in the 3rd Women's March, and that was a success. We organized a film screening in conjunction with the Workers Unite Film Festival, where we selected short films that had themes, relating to feminism, relating to social justice. I think our main film was Councilwoman, about a Latina woman in Rhode Island who cleaned hotel rooms for a living, and was an activist with her union, and then ran for city council in Rhode Island. And, just all the things she had to deal with just as a woman, and then facing racism, even when she won. When she won, she was still disrespected by her colleagues in City Hall. And that really resonated with the members who attended. And most recently, we organized a domestic violence awareness workshop in partnership with the Urban Justice Center Domestic Violence Project. And again, the idea for that came from the members. There are members, even though they're educated and we basically have middle-class jobs, they still feel overwhelmed if they're sorting through a domestic violence situation. They're worried about protecting their jobs, how to keep themselves safe and their family safe, how not to be completely financially destitute when you're trying to escape a domestic violence crisis. And so that was very necessary. And I myself am a survivor. My father was abusive, but I learned so much about how each case is different for each woman. So you can't presume to advise another woman necessarily. You have to really listen. So that's where we are now. I mean, one of the speakers from the prior panel said something about how every union our women's committees need to be Me Too committees. And I'm down for that. I think we are moving more in that direction. We do have, right now, one of our regional coordinators is also the lead of our contract team. We're in contract negotiations with wonderful Governor Cuomo. And she's very militant, which traditionally we are not. Traditionally, we are not very confrontational with our governors because the governors that's our boss. So there can be ramifications to standing up to the governor, but she's standing up to him. So if you want to follow us, look for the hashtag PEFDoesIt on Twitter and elsewhere, because that's all of us tweeting out what we do as state workers, because we want the governor and his team to realize, 'cause some of them just don't, the management team just doesn't seem to know what we do. At the contract table, they said, we could replace you with people off the street, right? So we're tweeting out the value of our work. And I think we ought to start adding a feminist element to it because, like you said, an attack on public sector work is in many cases an attack on women, an attack on minorities, and we are fighting back. But we're still finding our way as a women's committee.
Scarlett, when we had a conversation, like before this panel, and you were telling me that your union is a women's union, right? So I guess that what I would like us to explore, is like for you to tell us a bit more, like why is that, and if it's a women's union, why do you need a women's committee, right? Like, and what is the relation between like you coming together as women workers and the relation with the men workers in the union?
It's a question I don't really have an answer to. I look, we're broken down by regions, and Region 10 and Region 11 cover New York City, so that's where I do most of my work. And I see who the leaders are, and I see who the doers are. I see who shows up to get the work done of organizing membership meetings and panels and rallies, and it's mostly black women. It's mostly black women. And, so when I think about why do we need a women's committee, part of me thinks, every committee that we have is a women's committee, at least here in New York City, because it's black women doing the work. And sometimes I'm kind of afraid even, why am I chairing this committee? Really, this work is being done, maybe it's the Black Caucus that is the women's committee, and I should just be there as an ally. And yet it was black women who asked me to do this. So I do think we can start to speak about how these issues of understaffing, workplace violence, stagnant salaries are feminist issues, because of course they are. Of course they are. Because a lot of our workers are women, and they are black women, and they are immigrant women. We don't have paid family leave. You may be aware that that policy under Cuomo applies to private sector workers, and that the public sector, if they're unionized, have to negotiate for it. Within my union, there's a very stark divide. A lot of the workers in my union are older, and they don't want it because they have to pay out of pocket for it. The state isn't contributing anything towards paid family leave. It comes out of your paycheck, so you're contributing to somebody else's paid leave. So the older workers don't want it. They want to get ready to retire. They want their paycheck to be as big as possible in the years leading up to their retirement. And then the younger workers are like, well, what is the union doing for me? If you're not fighting for some version of paid family leave, what good are you? And in the context of Janus, where we have to constantly engage the members, which is good, but to keep them paying their dues and maintain their membership, that's just an ongoing battle. And that's a long, complex conversation that we need to have. One thing I've noticed in my union, and this is a little internal union politics, the president of my union, Mr. Wayne Spence, he's our first black president. He's a Jamaican immigrant, and he's wonderful. I love him. He's very savvy. He's very politically careful, about how he makes decisions on things for the union. At the same time, it's starting to dawn on me that my sisters, including my black sisters in the union, feel that maybe he's not confronting the Trump supporters enough. Like, maybe he should. He tries to keep things very abstract and issue-oriented, which I understand, but sometimes you got to name the thing. You got to say, you know, I know you voted for Trump, but here's all the anti-union things that he's done. Here's all the things that he's done that hurt women. Here's all the things, you know, there are women in our union, so you should be aware of that. A lot of us just attended a conference with AFT down in Montgomery, Alabama, which was the Human Rights, Civil Rights, and Women's Rights Conference. And we attended some wonderful trainings, and those of us who attended are going to be pushing the president to reproduce those trainings on transgender rights, women's rights, immigrant workers, which we don't talk enough about, the indigenous people. We had Native American speakers there, and of course the ongoing civil rights, struggles against anti-blackness in this country. We're gonna work on that, and it's gonna be the women doing that work.
Great. Thank you so much. I mean, I had one last question, but we can
I'm talking
table
too much.
it. No, for the Q&A. You already touched a little bit upon that, and the question was precisely, you know, how you as public sector workers, if you think that there's a possibility on that position to push for demands beyond, you know, like your workplace concerns, you know, like to engage with like broader social battles. Let's leave it for the discussion or keep it in our minds. So now we are going to move to our two speakers that work around reproductive justice. And the questions that I have for you are kind of like, very brief. Let's begin with Cindy. Cindy, what I want to ask you is like, how do you understand reproductive justice? What does that mean? And how do you see reproductive justice incorporating sort of like labor concerns and labor vocabulary and history, right? Specifically in the context of, you know, like how do we build a movement that goes beyond legislative change, right?
Okay, thanks. Thank you for inviting me. I'm Cindy Soohoo. I'm a professor at CUNY Law School, where I co-direct the Human Rights and Gender Justice Clinic, and I work on reproductive health and rights issues and try to do it from a reproductive justice perspective. It's funny for me to be on this panel with Jessica González-Rojas, who is a real expert on and leader in the reproductive justice movement, but we're together in this. Unfortunately, I missed the beginning of the first panel, but I just want to sort of reiterate what reproductive justice is and why it's just a tremendously powerful intersectional framework and how I think we should all be approaching the work that we're doing. Reproductive justice is really a movement that was founded by women of color in the 1990s. And it was really based on the issues that historically have impacted their community because they recognized that these issues were really not getting attention from the mainstream reproductive rights movement. And I hope that you guys, maybe you talked about it a little bit this morning. But I mean, I think it's really just from those experiences recognizing that we need to respect people's right to choose not to have a child, to choose to have a child, and to raise their children in a safe and healthy environment, right? And this is, the demands of reproductive justice really go much farther than legal demands or the traditional demands of the reproductive rights movement, because it's really about ensuring that everyone has the enabling conditions, right? A lot of times in the United States, me as a lawyer, we're sort of looking at whether something's legal and illegal, right? And for a lot of people, it doesn't make a difference. You know, in some ways, like if Roe versus Wade, and I'll talk about that in a second, right, gets overturned, some people can't get access to a clinic. Some people don't have health care, right? So we need to address those legal barriers, but we need to do much more. And I feel like that's why this is an exciting conversation for us to have in terms of how do we create enabling conditions for people to realize their reproductive rights and reproductive justice. And then I think, you know, the last thing I want to underscore about reproductive justice is it recognizes that everyone has the same rights, but that our rights are violated in different ways. Right? And even thinking about those three pillars, right? Thinking historically about the reproductive oppression that women of color faced, right? And thinking about how the challenges that people face in terms of deciding whether or not to be a parent or raising their children in a safe and healthy environment depend on who you are, right? It depends on your gender, it depends on your race, it depends on your immigration status, it depends on your disability status, and it also depends on how your labor is valued, right? And how society values your ability to have children. And we can talk about that more later if people are interested. So this is really an interesting exercise for me because I do reproductive justice work, and I mean, I think that thinking about class, as we're sort of thinking about how different identities impact people's ability to realize reproductive justice, I think class is a really important thing that we should be thinking about, as well as race and immigration status. And so I was thinking about the 3 pillars of reproductive justice and thinking about, and I thought as a lawyer I might highlight some of the challenges in each of those pillars. The first is the right to choose not to have a child. And I don't know whether people earlier talked about, and everyone's talking about what's going to happen with the next Supreme Court case, right, in terms of the Supreme Court, I guess in 2016, Jessica and I worked on a brief, sort of reaffirmed Roe versus Wade, but now they're basically taking another case that's basically the same case again, which is not a good sign. But, I think we'll see what happens. I mean, and I think that there is a real threat to Roe v. Wade, but I think the bigger threat is that they're just going to water down the standard. And that's going to mean that they're just going to be more, that abortion won't be illegal, or states won't have the ability to make it illegal, but they'll have the ability to impose more and more restrictions on abortion. And, this is an interesting moment because I think that poor women, women of color, rural women have long faced incredible barriers to access to abortion. And in some ways, maybe the mainstream middle-class women weren't noticing that. But what we're going to see is the ways in which, if the Supreme Court waters down the standard, we're just going to be seeing more laws that close down clinics, right? We're going to be seeing unnecessary overregulation. We're going to be seeing waiting periods. We're going to be seeing, things that make it more expensive for people to access abortion. And the people who are not going to be able to access abortion are going to be low-income women. The fact is that what we're looking at is a situation, both for abortion and contraception, where it's not a question of whether where it's going to become more of a privilege than a right. And that as long as you are a wealthy woman and you're able to travel and pay out of pocket, you'll be able to afford it. And I can talk a little bit more about the contraceptive mandate and attacks on contraception later if people are interested. But the other thing, just to underscore, I think one of the ways the feminist movement went wrong was when our failure to attack the Hyde Amendment, right? Because it was really about this was sort of when the Supreme Court said. We don't have to fund abortion care. The federal government doesn't have to fund abortion care, even if it's funding all other health services for low-income women, because we're not putting a barrier in your way. Right. So this is sort of this ridiculous distinction that the Supreme Court made, and I think that the mainstream liberal feminist movement failed to stand up, because they thought that. We still have a legal right to abortion, and they didn't really care about whether other people were having access. So just thinking about other things in terms of the right to have a child, I think there are multiple workplace policies that implicate whether a person can afford to have a child and whether or not they can have a healthy pregnancy. We have to look at issues like minimum wage. We have to look at the wage gap between men and women and the huge wage gap that women of color face. I think we have to think about whether or not there are anti-discrimination protections for women who are pregnant. We have to think about whether people are able to work in a safe and healthy environment when they're pregnant, whether or not there are obligations for your workplace to provide accommodations if you're pregnant. In terms of the right to parent, we need to think about environmental issues, right, in terms of whether or not your kid is living in a safe environment. I think what you raised before in terms of thinking about, making sure that our children have the right to a quality education, right, that goes to the right to parent. We need to be talking about paid leave and caregiver protections. And one thing I want to underscore, I worked on a report with the New York City Human Rights Commission last year looking at legal protections for pregnant people, for people who are breastfeeding and people who are caregivers. And the law in New York and New York City is actually better than in most places. But what the report found was there are certain communities and certain work sectors where it didn't actually matter that the law was good because the law couldn't reach them. And in part because the way the law is structured, a lot of times if you're working for a small employer, the law doesn't apply, right? So if you're a domestic worker, you're not protected, right? People who are actually caring for other people's children, when they need pregnancy leave, they're not protected, right? And then also thinking about, you have these legal protections, but if you're undocumented or you're a low-income worker, are you really going to raise a fuss with your employer, right? So even though, we might have the best legal protections, we need to be thinking about how are we organizing, how are we mobilizing, how are we supporting people, because even if there are these protections on the books, other situations in people's lives make it hard for them to actually realize those rights. Thanks.
Great. So now let's move to Jessica. And more or less, the question... Oh. Sorry. The question is similar, like what there, yeah. Well, I'm gonna stop touching that. I will give you this one when I finish. Okay. What do you understand by reproductive justice? Like the same question of how do you see sort of like as a realm of organizing, how do you see it like bringing labor concerns? And specifically, I just want to highlight that that the organization that you have been working with is focused not on advocacy but on organizing, right? Like, and sort of like how does that can inform a broader movement strategy? Yeah, please go ahead.
Now, can you hear me?
No, let's
I don't want to touch this thing. Oh, no. All right. I'm going to scoot over. So first off, thanks for having me. I am a member of the DSA, so hello, comrades. My name is Jessica González-Rojas, and I am the outgoing executive director of the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health. I'm showing up more as a member and an activist than in my official capacity, so I just have to say that. Cindy really hit the nail on the head in terms of defining reproductive justice, but a few things I want to add. There's an article that you all should look up in time.com, and it's called "We Are Grabbing Our Own Microphones, How Advocates for Reproductive Justice Stepped into the Spotlight." And it's literally from like this week. And it highlights an organization called Sister Song. And Sister Song is the women of color collective that was born out of those women, those black women who participated in a conference in 1994 when the Clinton administration was laying out their health care plan. And that health care plan was devoid of the needs and the issues that black women face. And a handful of black women ended up going to the hotel room and having a conversation about the invisibility of their experiences and their needs in these conversations, and recognizing that the term reproductive health or reproductive rights was completely out of reach of their reality. So Cindy mentioned the Hyde Amendment. The Hyde Amendment is a rider on every single appropriations bill that prohibits federal funds for abortion care. So basically that means that, sure, you can have an abortion, but if you are low income on Medicaid, if you are using Indian Health Services, if you're in the military, if you use, Veterans Health, any of the services that many in our communities use and need and use, you're prohibited from using that source of health insurance for abortion. So it means that those who are often most vulnerable, those who are often have the least resources, are denied the care. So we know when a legal right is on paper, but you can't achieve that right because you're denied the resources to achieve that right. That is not a right at all. Punto. right? So for us, as women of color reproductive justice advocates, we are always centering the lived experiences of women of color. We are always centering the lived experiences of immigrant women. We are always centering the experiences of trans and gender nonconforming folks who are often invisibilized in these conversations. So it is born out of a Black woman feminist like liberation theory, and really about ensuring that, again, not just the right to an abortion, right? That's just one piece of the full continuum of reproductive health care, but ensuring that we have access to prenatal care, sexuality education that's not demonizing to us, access to be able to raise your family with dignity. If you are an undocumented person whose child is ripped from your arms and put in a detention center, that is not dignity, right? If you are a Black mother you're afraid every single day that your son or your daughter is going to be shot, that's not dignity, right? So we have to center those experiences in our work. And it's outside the mainstream, right? It's outside the mainstream reproductive health and rights movement, because we're looking at the intersecting issues and conditions that our communities face. I often joke that there's like movement silos, right? There's like the women's movement or the immigrant movement, right? So I'm often in spaces where I'm in the in the women's rights or the reproductive rights movements, and I'm saying, what about Latinas? What about immigrants? What about queer people? And then I'm often in the Latino civil rights and immigrant rights spaces, and like, what about women? What about gender justice? What about queer people? And I actually find that some of the really most progressive LGBTQ organizations are actually most aligned in values. Sexual autonomy, pleasure, joy, dignity, justice. So, the work that I do and I've been doing for years is about looking at these issues through an intersectional framework and making sure that we're movements and communities are all aligned and moving forward, right? We have to so that's why labor for me is inextricably linked to our fight for reproductive justice. And our fight for reproductive justice is not just a framework, it's a movement and it's a vision, right? It's about building power. It's about dismantling interlocking systems of oppression. It's about healing trauma, right? And achieving liberation. And if you're not earning a living wage, if you're not in work conditions that are safe and healthy, if you are not being respected and treated with dignity in the workplace, like reproductive justice can't be achieved. It is inextricably linked. So the work that we do is really about centering those lived experiences and working across movements. We are part of an organization called a coalition called All Above All, which is fighting to lift the bans that deny abortion care, specifically the Hyde Amendment. But we're doing this in a very much centering the lived experiences of communities of color and workers' rights. So we're one of the organizations, the first organizations that worked alongside the efforts to fight for the $15 minimum wage increase, right? We work with the restaurant workers, right, who are mostly immigrant women or women of color, who earn such low wages that they're often dependent on Medicaid to get their health care, and if they need an abortion, they are denied that abortion, right? So you can't separate these issues. They're intersectional and interlocked. So we were one of the first organizations that really worked alongside that coalition, and in that coalition to elevate the reproductive justice framework in there. And we were able to push our women's rights, reproductive rights sisters to come along, right? And some of the more mainstream, more resourced organizations are now part of it. But it's really the women of color who are fighting at the center to say we are part of all these movements, right? These movements are our movements. We can't take, and I think it's sort of a theme you're hearing here, that reproductive justice is part of a very holistic fight for liberation. So to me, that it's, again, really inextricably linked. And, when we're looking at the threats on our lives and our bodies, we're going to see criminalization happen in really scary ways, particularly for immigrant women and those who don't have documentation. We work across the country, New York, DC, Virginia, Florida, and Texas. And in Texas, we work in the Rio Grande Valley, and we do organizing, and we build relationships and sort of cohorts and cadres of Latinas in the communities who are fighting at the forefront of these issues. We're shifting consciousness, because oftentimes we internalize the shitty messages we get about ourselves, right? That we are a drain on society, we have too many babies, we have too many abortions, which is hypersexualized, right? Like, those are the messages many of us Latinas face, and we're trying to sort of undo that and create the space to undo that, and then show our power, right? Because it's about the community power and elevating our own stories, our own experiences, and our own struggles, because we're closest to the problems. That means we're closest to the solutions. So we're doing that work in places like the Rio Grande Valley, where our women are criminalized for having abortions, because one of the cases we worked on was about a clinic that was shut down in the Rio Grande Valley that was the only clinic within, I think, 250 miles of that community. So if you needed an abortion, and most people who get abortions are actually already parents, you'd have to get childcare, you'd have to get, obviously money, you have to get a vehicle and gas and time off from your job that often doesn't provide time off. All sorts of, again, like one barrier in front of another. So what the government was trying to do was not make abortion illegal, but make it totally impossible to get. And we organized across the community to fight. And we actually submitted a brief to the Supreme Court, which I have dreams that, like, our dear Sonia Sotomayor was reading our briefs of Latina stories. I could just see it. But it was really exciting to actually center the stories and lived experiences of our communities that are most impacted by that. So that's our mantra, right? We do organizing. We look to shift the cultural narrative, because again, we're dealing with a problematic narrative about our hypersexualization of Latinas, or the virginal Catholic Latina, right? It's like one or the other. And I always say we're all of that and none of that. So, what's important is about centering the experiences of the community and centering the solutions of the community and creating the space to ensure that we're bridging the divide between sort of those in power and those who have power and can fight those in power to change the systems and structures so that we all can thrive.
Thank you so much, Jessica. So I think that now we just have perhaps a few minutes for questions. Let me check what is going on here. Yes, just a few minutes left for questions. Is anyone interested in raising a question? Perhaps we can take 3.
Hello, my name is Andrew Smith. I'm a member of the Freedom Socialist Party and also a shop steward in DC 37. I'll try to be brief. As a shop steward, I've done feminist work in my union, countering sexual harassment, and more recently, fighting for accommodations for pregnant workers. So pushing these issues into my local and into my union is something that is really important to me, and I'm happy to be learning about it. I'll make a quick comment, and then I have a question particularly for Gia. Because you talked about union democracy and not having the democracy in order to push these issues through, and I found that that's also a problem, and I'm interested to say a little bit more about it. So maybe I'll jump to my question to be concise. What specific difficulties do you see in that regard? What are the barriers that prevent us from moving democratically and pushing issues of reproductive justice into our unions or yours? And what strategies or tactics have you used or do you think of using to open up the unions in that way so that these issues can be pushed through? Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, let me just take perhaps just like a couple more because we have very little time. So perhaps, are there any other questions? Like we say, hablen ahora o callen para siempre. That this is the moment. Anyone?
Hi. This panel is great. So much to think about, but specifically for Scarlett, thinking about the nurturing frame and keeping in mind your comment that we can't presume to advise other women, you have to listen. But it struck me, the notion of calling people who are in your union sisters who are in the Department of Correction. I think of the end of this one chant and protest that I've been to, lose your job, that shit don't matter. What would it look like to try and get them other jobs, people who are up for it, to be, I don't know, retrained internally? I don't know, it just struck me, and thank you for giving us a window into those internal struggles. Thanks.
Which microphone's working?
One more opportunity for one more. Cami has a question face, no? What's up? No? Okay, so then, yes, okay. Can you?
Thank you. The first one for the labor organizers, that, even if it is reductive to call them, to call you so, is in order the way in which the union has been capable. Some unions, not all of them, but some unions have been capable of overcoming their own boundaries and to build the connection with other social organizations and political demands, and how it has been carried out during time, because of course we have seen for example, the teachers' strike wave as a powerful moment of upsurge, but it has been built through time and how it has been carried on. In terms of the last intervention, it is very interesting how exactly this hypersexualization of Latinas shows us how the sexual freedom of women is a privilege of class. It's been built as a kind of privilege of class. So if you are from working class, actually you are constrained between the idea of being a kind of, sexually not disciplined, and at the same time, or this kind of welfare queens. You're just, but at the same time you are not you are not allowed to access birth control or abortion. So this is very interesting how it has to do with also the idea of disciplining working class. And the last one is about what I think Cynthia was talking about, the last evolutions in terms of limitation of abortion in the United States, and how it has been before having Kavanaugh in the Supreme Court and this kind of treat on Roe versus Wade, we have been facing an ongoing process of limitation in terms of protocols and procedures. That is something very new, that in the last decades has been affirmed, and how in this specific process, which role played also technology, because we know that, for example, the heart beating, I don't know, I don't remember the exact name, but how it becomes something that makes an arbitrary decision of the doctor to detect this moment and in terms of days, and so how this changes also the framework, the legal framework in which it is we can think the Roe versus Wade and then abortion access.
Great, thank you. Who wants to go first? Tia, perhaps? Yeah.
All right, I'll address the first question. Any other UFT members in the audience? You can out yourself. Hey. Shout out. So you can ask almost any UFT member. The obstacles we face in our union is that, and we've seen this kind of wave or emergence the last 50 or plus years in union bureaucratization. And basically, our union leadership becoming an arm of the government, of our bosses. They serve as a function, and in particular in New York State, it's through the Democratic Party. So negotiations happen behind closed doors. Decisions are already made, and when they're brought to members, it's like, oh, this is the best deal we're gonna get. You hear that a lot. You may be hearing, like if you're in a union, you've heard this. Look, the local upstate is getting this. They wish they had what we had, right? They've even said things like that. And these are obstacles because then members think, oh no, we should just be happy. We should be happy with what we have. This develops complacency and a lack of real understanding of our ability to use our power, our worker power. And one of the strategies we've been trying to work is also thinking about our frame and how we think about power. We look up elections, individuals, and positions of power. Our power is here. And that's where we have to look to see that we can actually change things. And there are examples of it. There's proof all across the country through the teacher strikes, through all the strike waves, right? And I want to just point out, just take an opportunity to share the books that I brought. One is Naomi Klein's A Battlefield Paradise, Puerto Rico Takes on Disaster Capitalists, right? This book right here is such a great, easy read, but it's developed on the indigenous, basically practices that saved like a mountainous region where everywhere else on the island was completely like devoid of any food, water. It was because there was a small community up in the mountains that had maintained indigenous practices in a nurturant model. And it was educators. There was a school that had been farming indigenous root vegetables. You need to diversify crops. Little things like that, they were teaching children because it's about sustainability. And the teachers, through FMPR, the Federation of Teachers which is the more radical, progressive union, teachers union there, really at the forefront of that. And then another book I highly recommend is The Red State Revolt. This is by Eric Blanc. The teachers' strikes and working class politics. And this is a really great juxtaposition of the southern states, right? Where so many of the teachers voted for Trump and had a taste of radicalization. They may not even be aware of it, in the moment, but that's what happened. They realized their power in a right-to-work state. And then this is most recently a friend of mine, she doesn't consider herself an academic, but she spent more than almost 2 decades in Brazil, studying the landless workers movement. Anybody familiar with them? So this I cannot recommend more highly because for over 20 years, a group of workers basically developed a strategy. So again, it's not a focus on elections, right? They had a fascist conservative government 20, 30 years ago. They were able to, through grassroots feminist movement, to take over education and occupy land and force a fascist government to provide funding for the kind of education and ideals and values that we're talking about here, and how they've been able to progress even through the current fascist administration. Highly recommend because it has broad implications for our strategies here and where we think we're looking for power and how we implement them. Because it wasn't through elections. It was through basically swarming their institutions, all of their government institutions. So.
Before we move to the next answer, I just wanted to mention super quick about the teachers in Puerto Rico that, we had like some other conversation with some of them. And one very notorious thing is that in the context of the hurricane, the teachers were, the state was nowhere to be seen, right? Like the teachers were the ones that actually step up to take like basic social sort of like tasks. Occupying schools, so organizing the community through the schools. So that's another like super important kind of like example of the role of teachers in the public sector, right? And how they took on sort of like this like regenerating the social fabric in Puerto Rico. So please.
I think there was a question directed to me about kind of the law enforcement titles within my union. And as a DSA person, and as someone who has tried to be an ally to the Black Lives Matter movement, I tend to be anti-prison and somewhat anti-police, but I have to approach that very carefully because my sisters are in law enforcement. The president of my union is a parole officer, and I attended a panel one time where, I kind of cringed a bit, but it's true. He said that he wears the Black Lives Matter button, but also the Blue Lives Matter button. But it's true. He carries a weapon. He's law enforcement. And right now there's a bill, I believe it's called Less is More, and it's here in New York, it's statewide. It's the idea that we don't want so many parolees sent back to prison for relatively minor technical violations. And me, the great white liberal socialist, whatever I am, I'm in favor of that, but my sisters and brothers are not. They have a great deal of trepidation about that. They are worried that it's going to increase crime in their communities. They're also worried about their jobs. I mean, first and foremost, the job of a union is to protect your members' jobs. So I believe the question was, is there a way to get them new jobs? And I think they would be open to criminal justice reform and an anti-prison movement if there was a guarantee, if there was a just transition, shall we say. Like maybe many of them do have kind of a social worker mentality in the way they assist their parolees. So maybe we need to hire more social workers and train parole officers and others who work in those facilities to do similar work that's more rooted in compassion and rehabilitation rather than punishment.
I don't think there was a specific question, but I think your point about privilege, pleasure being a privilege of class is really on point. And one thing that's exciting about Sister Song, which is, again, an organization we're part of, and in that article, please read it, they literally spent, the varieties of topics that they talked about in the workshops were everything from, the intersection of environmental justice and reproductive justice to pleasure. Right, and there was, I don't know if they did it this year, but last time they had a naked workshop, right? And to address sort of, bodily autonomy and shame and, things that many women of color face around our own bodies, right? And it was so taboo, but it was such a powerful thing I wasn't part of it, but I was like down for like it happening. But it's very taboo to talk about sex as pleasure, right, in our communities, and particularly amongst many of us who are Latinas or immigrants, it's very much about procreation. And I think we need to talk about sexual liberation, right? And it's almost a privilege to do that, and a form of radical activism to do that.
Well, thank you so much. I think that we are out of time, right? It's Cindy. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's just like I was just through my eyes.
Do we have?
Yes. Okay.
Sorry. I mean, maybe I just want to respond to your questions. I mean, I think thinking about the role of technology in the context of reproductive justice is really interesting. And I think your point about, when we got ultrasounds and things, like it gave more power to the doctors. And I think we're sort of facing the same thing with the abortion pill, right? Because that creates the opportunity for people for self-managed care. But we're sort of seeing that that's been over-regulated, and that people who are actually engaging in self-managed care are being criminalized, right? And so technology should be a vehicle for bringing about freedom, but it's being used in an over-medicalized and in a legal context where we're criminalizing people who are trying to manage their own care. And then just on the ongoing process to undermine people's access. I think this also relates to a point that was made in the panel this morning. And I mean, I started to go there in thinking about, where liberal feminists went wrong, with the Hyde Amendment, right? Because it really, was about saying, the state, even though it was providing basic medical services for a certain population, it's not going to provide this one, right? And then what that's really led to, and I wrote an article that's called Hyde Care for All, because I think what it really led to was this idea that the state could be weaponized. Right, so then the next thing that we saw was that states were passing laws saying that abortion couldn't be provided in public hospitals. And then we were sort of seeing states pass laws that were over-regulating abortion, putting people out of business. And now what we're seeing is the state penalizing providers like Planned Parenthood, right? So Planned Parenthood doesn't get government funding to provide abortions, but they're basically saying you can't participate, right, in Medicaid and other programs if you provide abortion, right? So it's really just, and it just really opened the door, and now it's impacting us all. But it was really because we the liberal feminists, I think, failed to recognize that we have, when we have a right, it should be a right for all. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, everyone.